Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great day so far. For those of you in Florida, I hope you are staying warm on this unseasonably cold morning that we've got here. Welcome to office hours for FDOT, ADA, and Design, Construction, and Maintenance. We're very glad to have you here. If you've not been to one of our office hour sessions before, this is a laid-back session. We've taken the questions that you've submitted during registration, some of the questions we didn't get to during the training in November, and also we're going to be taking questions live today too. We're going to give you an opportunity to ask those and just an informal session to get your questions answered. So we are the Florida LTAP Center, and we've been housed in Tampa at the University of South Florida for about 5 years. We serve the entire state of Florida through a variety of services, as you can see here on your screen. Our website is floridaltap.org. This is where you can find a lot of information about what's going on for the Florida LTAP Center. We've got our training calendar, including not only our trainings, but those of other agencies like FHWA and FDOT as well. So I encourage you to check that out. And we've also got our recorded webinars here. We've got about 250 posted there. They're all eligible for certificates, so I encourage you to check those out. If you missed the November 2nd training for ADA, we have that posted, so be sure to find that if you missed that training. And we're on social media at FLLTAP. All right, so in the chat pod today, we've got Samantha Samford, who is the State Local Program Administrator with FDOT. So she may be answering some of your questions in chat today, and just here as a resource. So if you have any questions for her, of course, feel free to put those in as well. And we've also got Urel Lopez, who I'm going to hand it over to now to introduce herself.
Hi, how are you, everyone? I'm Urel Lopez from Puerto Rico Highway Transportation Authority. I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I can answer any question that you have to. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Urel. And we've also got Bradley here, who is going to be talking us through some of these questions today. So Brad, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started.
Well, hi there. Thank you, Kristen. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. As Kristen said, we're going to try to keep it somewhat informal and more discussion oriented. So bear with us if there's any hiccups in the technology or whatever, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So, all right, well, in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. So this is the office hours. I guess specifically you could say the Q&A session that is a companion session to the webinar delivery that we did back in on the 2nd of this month. And these are questions that we received at registration for this event. So we'll do that one first. Okay, the first question says, is ADA enforceable in a homeowners association or in a community development community or CDC? I'm not exactly sure what that is, but community development district is what I was expecting it to be. So is ADA enforceable in those entities within the county limits? And the answer is definitely yes. ADA is a nationwide law, and it is applicable to all entities that are providing services to the public. For the case of DOT, we fall under ADA Title II, as does Urel's organization, the PRHTA in Puerto Rico. But Title II covers state and local government entities or agencies. But for this particular question, homeowners associations and other private entities that are providing services to the public fall under ADA Title III. And that is not my area of expertise, so I would definitely encourage folks, if you have questions that would fall into Title III, that you would work with perhaps your county code enforcement office or some other entity there that covers that in more detail than I can. So with that said, we'll go to the next question. Can you discuss when and when not to use special emphasis crosswalk markings? And I definitely can. And I guess as a quick segue to that, I did want to show some references. For DOT, this is certainly applicable to any project on the state highway system. Our address is fdot.gov/roadway/ FDOT.gov/ADA, and that will bring up the DOT's ADA webpage. And you can see here on the left side of the screen, there's a lot of resources that are available. And the first one I want to point out to you is this ADA FAQ for frequently asked questions. And I've already opened that window here. It is a PDF, and it does have some navigation ability for bookmarking over here as categorized by topic. And on the screen now, I'm showing ADA for transportation projects, and then national resources are listed first, and there are several there. Yeah, some national resources are available there, and then state resources specific to the FDOT are also provided on the FAQ. And then there's quite a bit there for the state, and then local, city or county. The single reference we have there is to the Florida Green Book. And I've also opened most of those links in the window that you're seeing now. Here's the one for the FDOT design manual. So you could even go back in time and see what the requirements were back historically, all the way back as far as the plans prep manual, which was the predecessor to the FDM. Also, this is I guess the landing page for the standard plans. I wanted to show you that. This is the landing page for the standard specifications library. And just click on that center icon there, and you'll have access to the DOT spec book. Here's the landing page for the Florida Green Book. There's lots of information there available for local government entities. That would be cities and counties. You have the Florida Building Code that's available from the Department of Business and Professional Regulation website. You have the Florida statutes. That's a pretty easy find, probably with a simple Google search. You have the Florida Administrative Code. And then last but not least is the federal guidance at the federal level is ADA.gov. And that's where you can find the text for both the regulations and the current applicable standards, as well as the PROAG document. And we're going to address PROAG more specifically as we move forward. But I did want to share those. And to be honest with you, if I get a call or an email, then I'm going quickly to one of these references so I can cite specific language that answers the question. And I would encourage the audience to take advantage of some of those references and use Control F, which is a fantastic feature in searching web pages and PDFs. And if you exhaust yourself there and you still can't find the answer, then please feel free to reach out to me, and we'll do the best we can to answer it. But we'll go right back to question number 2. Can you discuss when and when not to use special emphasis? So I'm going to show you, using those references, how I would try to find that. So I'm going to go to the design manual. I'm going to click on part 2 for design criteria. And then within that, I happen to know, because of what I do, that it's going to be in the pedestrian facilities chapter, which is right here, chapter 222. You can, I believe, you can open the entirety of the manual, and then that allows your Control F search to search the entirety of the volume, which is helpful if you don't know a particular chapter that the answer is in. But in this case, well, you know what? We'll open it up that way. No, I'm not going to, because it does take a while. It has to download the entire volume. So I'm going to click here, chapter 222. Then I'm going to use Control F. I'm going to type special emphasis, because that was the question. And here we are in chapter 222.2.3 for crosswalks. And it says use special emphasis crosswalk markings for all marked crosswalks except the following. It says use standard crosswalk markings at marked stop controlled intersection approaches. So the way I interpret that is for the connecting minor street. You would want to, when the minor street connects to the main line with a marked stop controlled intersection, then you would want to provide standard crosswalk markings. Otherwise, the expectation from DOT is that special emphasis crosswalk markings are going to be provided. So with that, we'll go to the next one that we received for this event. Will FDOT Index 522 be modified for ramps or tactile surfaces to be in line with crosswalks? And then if not, is there a selection process? Well, I'm going to bring back over the browser and I'm going to go to the standard plans. I'll kill that one. Standard plans, the current issue that becomes effective this January 1 of 2024. We'll just go ahead and open that one. And then I know that the question is referencing index 522. So 002 is the one for detectable warnings and sidewalks. So we'll click there. And now we see on the first sheet, this is sheet 1 of 7 for this particular index. There's a stub, if you will, of the crosswalk markings that's provided in the diagram that's labeled curb ramp nomenclature. You can see the stubs are perfectly in line and parallel with the direction of the ramp, or vice versa. The ramp is perfectly in line with and parallel to the direction of the crosswalk markings. I believe this is probably the only picture within this 7-sheet detail or standard that actually shows the crosswalk markings, and that's intentional because these are standard details, and the number of variations that are going to occur around the state from intersection to intersection, and probably within the same intersection from corner to corner, the amount of details are going to vary so significantly that there is no way whatsoever that the DOT could provide a standard plan solution for every possible scenario. So the expectation is that engineering judgment is going to be applied by the engineers who are contracted by the DOT to provide design plans. And those engineers, as they exercise their engineering judgment, are going to appropriately apply the appropriate detail for a curb ramp. So I believe that answers the question. So is 522 going to be modified to show inline crosswalks? The answer to that most likely is going to be no, not beyond what I just explained. And if not, is there a selection process? The process is that the engineering community is going to have to exercise appropriate engineering judgment for the appropriate and proper application of these standard plan details. And then beyond that, they're going to have to expand and provide additional details as appropriate for each site-specific location. Because again, standard plan details are a pictorial representation of the absolute minimum values that can be accepted on the state highway system. Beyond that, the expectation is that the details will be provided by the engineer that are site specific. Okay, the next question says, do you have suggestions to local agencies for ADA compliance during temporary traffic control and maintenance of traffic to improve safety? And the answer to that is, from a statewide perspective, I would encourage the audience to reference FDM Chapter 240. That's going to be the Transportation Management Plan chapter, and it goes into some level of detail there about what the expectations are for the engineering community and the transportation industry in general for applying appropriate details for temporary traffic control. Also, I would direct your attention to the specifications for temporary traffic control expectations from the DOT, and let me pull that reference up here. So I'm going to kill that one. We'll go to the standard specifications, click on the icon, and now I'm just simply going to search for Americans with disabilities. And it takes a little bit because it's basically having to download the entire volume of the spec. But you can hopefully here on the screen, as I read through this, you'll understand what the expectations are. But in Standard Plans Index 10, or excuse me, Standard Specifications Index 102-3.4, which covers pedestrian and bicycle accommodations. The expectation is that, remember, the spec book is directed to the contractor. So the contractor is directed to provide accommodations for pedestrians as shown in the temporary traffic control TTC plans. So that first part of that sentence says very explicitly that the expectation is that there will be details in the plans, in the project plans for temporary traffic control that the contractor can build. So this was a change that occurred, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago to the specifications that made the engineer of record for the project responsible for providing temporary traffic control details in the plans. Prior to that, it was the contractor's responsibility to provide pedestrian access during construction. But that was changed about 3 or 4 years ago. And now we have an engineering plan centric responsibility for TTC for pedestrians in the plans. And we can discuss that further if anybody has any questions about that. Okay, and that concludes the number of questions that we received at registration for this event. So I think now is a good time, Kristen and Sam, to find out if anything's been submitted real time.
Hi, Brad. This is Kiriana. We don't have any questions at this time, so if you want to go
Okay.
ahead and proceed.
All right, thanks, Kiriana.
No problem.
We will go forward then. These are some questions that we gleaned from the presentation that we gave on November 2nd. So the first one is in the category of criteria. Can you briefly cover the new PROAG criteria, and is it incorporated into FDOT materials? And can you explain why the PROAG is not included in the list of guidance for design of pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way? Okay, so here's the scoop with PROAG. The U.S. Access Board, back in the middle of August, they did officially, quote unquote, adopt PROAG as their recommended standard. But there was a lot of confusion surrounding that decision and that announcement. And unfortunately, the messaging that surrounded that announcement was not very clear and pretty broadly misunderstood. That does not obligate legally any entity within the United States to begin following PROAG. What that adoption process by the Access Board did, though, was advance PROAG to the next step in the journey to become enforceable. So the next step following adoption by the Access Board is for the US DOT and the US DOJ, DOT obviously Department of Transportation and DOJ is the Department of Justice. Each federal agency will independently post a notice of proposed rulemaking for adoption of PROAG by those agencies and for its implementation. And then there will be a public comment period during which time each agency will independently receive comments from both the public and I would assume every Department of Transportation at the state and local level all across the country. If you can imagine, I would think that there's likely going to be a ton of comments to work through because it's kind of a big deal. All of those comments will need to be processed and addressed. And after that public comment period, each of those two federal agencies will have to make their final rule and then implement and adopt that rule. So at the earliest, we anticipate that it would be sometime in 2024, probably middle or late 2024. And there's another big political event that's going on in 2024. So who knows if this process will be advanced to try to be ahead of that event in November, or if it might be, it might fall aside while other things are happening there in DC. So anyway, that's just Brad's commentary. That please don't take that as being a DOT's official whatever stance on PROAG. But suffice it to say that PROAG is not officially enforceable by federal law at this time, and the earliest that we could expect that to occur would probably be in mid to late 2024. So it's not officially incorporated, bullet 2 there, into FDOT materials, because DOT has been proactive with the expectation that PROAG was coming. So the FDM, that's the FDOT design manual, and our standard plans are already substantially compliant with PROAG. And in most cases, we exceed the PROAG minimums. The Office of Design here in the central office of DOT in Tallahassee will continue to monitor future developments concerning PROAG and will make adjustments as needed. But for now, though, no adjustments were needed because of the proactive nature of how DOT has expected PROAG to come to the forefront. And third bullet is, can you explain why PROAG is not included in the list of guidance? And it's for the same reason as what I just said. Okay, the next question, and Sam and Kiriana or Kristen, if we end up getting some live questions that are relevant for the particular topic that's being discussed, or you just want to break in and let me know, then we can definitely do it that way too.
Hey, Brad. Well, since you paused, I will jump in with a question that we received.
Perfect.
This question is about the ladder bars crossing a travel path. So are preformed thermo required in high emphasis crosswalks, or can extruded thermo be used?
That is a very good question, and unfortunately, that is beyond my area of expertise. That's getting more into a materials issue or something specific that the central office the central office traffic engineering and operations folks can probably answer a whole lot better than I could, because I'd just be speculating. So I would definitely encourage you to reach out to our traffic ops office here in Tallahassee and answer or to ask that question.
All right, thanks, Brad. That's all we've got in the chat pod now. And just a reminder to our folks on the line, enter your questions at any time. And if you want to unmute and speak to Brad, just raise your hand and we'll be work with you on those permissions. So back to you, Brad.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Kristen. So the question that's on the screen now, oops, I need to go backwards. The question reads, can supplemental plaques be lower than 7 feet? And this is specifically a reference to the vertical clearance requirements over the walking surface of pedestrian facilities. So we're going to go back to the FDOT FDM, the FDOT design manual, go to chapter 222. And as I mentioned before, Control F is a fantastic tool. So I'm gonna hit Control F and type vertical clearance. And that brings us to section 222.2.1.2 for vertical clearance. And it says provide a minimum 7-foot vertical clearance over the entire walking surface. So essentially, to answer the question, there are no exceptions to this 7-foot vertical clearance to fixed objects. That 7-foot vertical clearance is for the entirety of the walking surface width. So if you take the neat lines of the walking surface, whether it's a concrete sidewalk or whether it's a asphalt shared use path, if you take the quote unquote the neat lines of the edges of those walking surfaces and you extend them vertically to a point 7 feet above the walking surface, that entire clearance window, I call it, has to be clear of any obstructions. So that's nothing piercing that window either horizontally from the side or vertically from above. That entire window must be completely clear over the entire walking surface. The next question is, what is used in the median if the sidewalk is 10 feet or more to prevent motorists from using the area to make U-turns? This is an interesting question, and I haven't heard of this ever being an issue. To this point, maybe no one has utilized a full 10-foot width in the median pass-through. But my answer to this is that if it were to become an issue or a concern during plans development, then I would definitely encourage the engineer of record to have a conversation with the district project manager on that. My gut instinct from my position as the ADA coordinator would be to consider the introduction of concrete bollards or something like that, but that's not going to be widely accepted or even a reasonable approach because of the introduction of obstructions in the roadside. So yeah, I think that's definitely, if that was to be a concern or an issue, that you would definitely need to have that discussion with the district project manager, and they may want to bring in the district design engineer into that conversation to see the best way to address that. Y'all please feel free to post some questions, or again, as Kristen has stated, to raise your hand and we can unmute you and address them live, real time. But we'll just keep going on with what the questions that we captured from the last webinar until that happens. So is there a minimum, excuse me, is there a minimum distance the sidewalk can be constructed when the road has flush shoulders? And that is going to be answered in the FDM. So I'm going to pull that window back up. I'm going to go back to chapter 222, and it's going to be an early section here. So I'm going to section 222.2.1 for sidewalk. This is the FDM, chapter 222, section 2.1 for sidewalk. And the sentence that I was thinking about is right here in this paragraph. It says sidewalk on flush shoulder roadways is not to be constructed directly adjacent to the roadway or shoulder pavement. So what that says to me is that the sidewalk for a flush shoulder roadway must have some separation from the edge of pavement. Now, there's nothing here that specifies what that separation has to be as far as distance or material. So there's flexibility given to the engineer to exercise engineering judgment and the competence in their practice to make a choice. But I would, if you have any concerns at all, then definitely you would want to discuss that with the district PM.
And Brad, there was a question. What about
Okay.
vegetation within the vertical clearance?
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Sam. I should have mentioned that as well. But the clearance to fixed objects, as I stated a moment ago, is 7 feet, and that's over the entire walking surface. The clearance to vegetation, tree limbs and other vegetation types, is to 8.5 feet. So again, if you extend those neat line edges of the walking surface vertically up to a point 8.5 feet above the walking surface, then that entire window that's encapsulated by that rectangle, that clearance window, must be free of any obstructions, either from the side horizontally or from the top vertically. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, I had
Okay,
a comment come in that someone said that they saw a four-wheel truck use a median with extensive landscaping to make a U-turn, and it doesn't seem that the landscaping was a deterrent enough for that U-turn.
Well, yeah, I guess those kinds of situations, it's impossible to design for people that are just absolutely going to ignore all norms and laws and that sort of thing. So we do the best we can as the state transportation agency, but we can't design and prevent everybody from doing whatever level of foolishness they want to engage in. But thank you for that comment, Kristen. The question on the screen now reads, except the situation that the sidewalk is next to a roadway, are there any situations where sidewalk grade can go more than 5%? And the answer to that generally is no, because greater than 5% is considered by the ADA and by the Florida Building Code to be an ADA ramp. And with that, if you're not adjacent to the roadway, and let me go ahead and pull up that reference too. So I'm going to go back to the internet here. I'll go back to chapter 222, which I'm there, and I'm going to search for Control F, the word mirror, and it states right here in chapter 222, section 2.1.3 for grades and cross slopes, that when sidewalk is adjacent to the roadway, that is, it's located back of curb or consistent separation from the curb, sidewalk grades may mirror the roadway profile. So that's for the mainline sidewalk that's considered quote unquote adjacent to the roadway. And then there's a little bit more clarification here. It says that is, i.e., located back of curb or a consistent separation from the curb. So to readdress the question, except for that situation where you have a mainline sidewalk that's adjacent to the roadway, are there any situations where sidewalk grade can go more than 5%? And the answer is no. Above 5% is considered a ramp, and the ramp limitations are greater than 5% and less than or equal to 8.33%. So any grades that are not adjacent to the roadway, that are that are on the mainline roadway sidewalk, grades that exceed 5% up to 8.33% are considered an ADA ramp, and you'll have to apply the handrails, level landings. You have vertical rise limitations of 30 inches, I believe it is. But for that issue, the reference is going to be the Florida Building Code. And I recall, or if you recall, I did list that in the references here in my internet browser. If you go to the Florida, just type in Florida Building Code in the search browser, it should bring you to the Department of Board and Professional Regulation, and then you can click on this link here on the left side, Florida Building Code, and we'll do it here, Florida Building Code, and then you have to find the most recent version, which is 7th edition 2020, and you click there, and it will bring up another page, and the particular version that we're looking for is the accessibility edition. So it's right here, the 2023 Florida Building Code Accessibility 8th edition is this one right here. So you can click on that and then use Control F and go your merry way with the information in hand. Okay, the
We have
next
a
Brad, what about in
question.
the case
question.
of oh, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, you're fine. Go ahead.
Oh no, someone asked, what about causeway bridges or just bridges in general?
Well, bridges in general, by nature, are following the roadway's profile. So as long as the sidewalk is on the bridge structure and is following the profile grade of the roadway, which it has to by convention, then it's covered by that provision in the FDM that says that the sidewalk grades are permitted to follow the roadway profile when they're adjacent to a roadway. So yeah, you don't have any concerns at all as far as the sidewalk grades when it's on the bridge structure. Is that it for that one?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Next question is there a limit on longitudinal sidewalk slope for a sidewalk that follows a steep roadway? For instance, a section of roadway may be at, say, 15% longitudinal grade. Well, the provision that we just read from the FDM says that the sidewalk profile is permitted to mirror or follow the mainline roadway profile. So if the mainline roadway profile is 15%, then the sidewalk can mirror that. A case in point for that would be if you're familiar with the topology of Tallahassee here in the downtown area. Tallahassee is well understood to be founded on basically 7 hills, and there are some pretty steep grades of the roadways here in downtown Tallahassee, and it would be impossible to provide ADA compliant sidewalk grades unless that that provision that we have mentioned was available. There's no way you could have enough room or right of way to have appropriate switchbacks and level landings and rise limitations of 30 inches and so forth. That couldn't happen. So this was a provision that was borrowed from PROAG over a decade ago, when PROAG was first published back in the early 2000s. The next question is, we have concrete truncated domes at several locations. Instead of detectable warning mats, should we replace the concrete domes with pedestrian detectable warning mats? And I would say the answer, unfortunately, with this limited information provided here, is going to be it depends. And the reason I say that is because if you have a 3R project on the state highway system, then the answer, the depending part of the answer is absolutely yes. You have to upgrade the detectable warning surfaces to current standard, because that was a historical agreement between the Florida FHWA division and the FDOT, and that memo is actually available on the FAQ document, which I'm going to pull up here as soon as I can get to that window. Back here at fdot.gov/roadway/ADA. If you click on the FAQ document, which is the first resource or first link under the resources header, then you can scroll down under the national reference list here, and there is a, let's see which one it is. I have to remember which one it is. I know it was signed by, on the federal side, by Mr. Richter. So you see how useful Control F can be when you're looking for the information in these documents. But question 2.13 says, are deficient sidewalks required to be reconstructed during 3R project? And we're talking specifically now in this question about curb ramps and detectable warnings. So if you look at this memo, which is actually dated August 18th, 2003, so 20 years ago, and it was sent to then chief engineer, I believe, Brian Blanchard, or maybe he was the state roadway engineer at the time. But the secretary was Mr. Abreu, and I'm not going to read this memo out loud because now you know how to find it. But suffice it to say that the arrangement between DOT and FHWA was that curb ramps and detectable warning surfaces were to be upgraded to existing standards at such time as a 3R project went through that area. Okay, the next question is, are detectable warnings needed at the following conditions? When upgrading a ramp by an alleyway when no stop signs are present? Well, the answer is no, and I'll show you where that answer is found in the FDM. The next area was where a sidewalk crosses an asphalt bike path. That's going to require engineering judgment, and you're not going to find any specific guidance in the FDM for that condition specifically. But I think we kind of addressed this out loud in the webinar on 11.2, and as I recall, the discussion was it was pretty much going to be dependent on the nature and volume of bike traffic on that bike path. If it's pretty significant, then I think engineering judgment would probably dictate that it would be appropriate to have a detectable warning surface for a sidewalk that crosses that path. But it's going to be way too dependent on the specifics of a particular location. So you're not going to find that addressed specifically in the guidance. It boils down to engineering judgment. The third scenario here is at a commercial driveway. So I'm going to show you in the FDM where that can be found, and pull that window up here. We're back in chapter 222, and I'm going to use Control F, and I'm just going to type in commercial driveway. And that takes me right to what I needed to know. Chapter 222, section 3 for detectable warnings. It says blah, 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 2 feet deep in the direction of travel. They are required on sidewalks at the following locations. And the third bullet was asking about commercial driveways. Well, here's the guidance on providing detectable warning surfaces at commercial driveways. The first bullet asked about providing detectable warning surface at non-signalized or controlled alleyways. And the answer to that is no. And the reason is because it is not a commercial driveway necessarily, but it's definitely, in the question, it said it was non-controlled. So since there is no stop sign, yield sign, or traffic signal, there is no warrant for that kind of control at that intersection. So then a detectable warning surface is generally not going to be provided there. But again, as with every situation, it's going to be dependent upon the appropriate and proper application of engineering judgment and principles. The next question is a shared use path setback from a flush shoulder roadway as required, considered to be adjacent to the roadway, therefore able to mirror the grade of the roadway. And generally speaking, the only language in the FDM, and pull that window back up, and we'll, if you recall, I searched for the word mirror because it's highly doubtful that that word occurs more than once in the FDM. And it says when it's adjacent to the roadway, and the key word is adjacent, and it says located back of curb or a constant separation. So the question was a shared use path that's set back from a flush shoulder. Can you follow the grade of the roadway? I would say, yes, you can, with the assumption that the shared use path is following the alignment of the mainline roadway, where a shared use path, in my mind, cannot follow the that provision that allows it to follow the profile grade of the adjacent roadway is when there's not an adjacent roadway. So the shared use path is going off on an independent alignment through the woods, let's say, like for the St. Mark's Trail here in Tallahassee and Leona County. There are a lot of times where that shared use path is not parallel to or adjacent with a roadway. So you can't take advantage of a provision in that case. So when that happens, if there are grades greater than 5%, then you have to provide railings and appropriate or correct grades greater than 5% or and not exceeding 8.3%.
Hey, Brad, going back to the previous question where we were talking about commercial properties, is a condo complex considered a commercial property?
I would say yes, definitely, and it's all based on volume, because we received a question similar to this before, where the question came in and it was an apartment complex that had a single driveway connecting to a state road, and the answer that I gave is yes, of course you would want to provide detectable warning surfaces for that condition, because the whole purpose of the detectable warning surface is safety. We want to improve the safety and accessibility of our pedestrian facilities. And if you have a large volume apartment or condominium complex that's going to have traffic flow into and out of that particular location, then probably it's already going to be a controlled intersection, and it should definitely have the detectable warning surface. If we go back to that section of the FDM, just to point out a distinction here. Commercial. There is language here that says detectable warnings should not be placed where sidewalk intersects sidewalks that run continuously through residential driveways. So in my mind, this is referring to single family dwelling residential driveways and not apartment complexes or condominium installations there. Was that it, Kristen?
It was, thank you.
Okay, Thank you. Okay, on the pedestrian signals, is it a good practice to provide future provisions for APS, accessible pedestrian signals? An example is, providing spare conduits and conductors for audible type, etc. I'm glad this question came in, and I apologize that I did not specifically address it during the 11.2 webinar, but I'm going to go out of chapter 222. We're going to go to chapter 232. And again, if you didn't know these chapter numbers, this 232 happens to be for signalization. If you don't know the chapter numbers, then I would encourage you to download the entirety of volume 2 of the FDM and then use Control F to perform your search. But in this case, I know the answer is in 232, so we'll bring that up. And then I know that it's in 232 section 6.1. And this specifically answers that question. So section 6.1 of chapter 232, accessible pedestrian signal feature, it actually says where pedestrian facilities are provided, include provisions, that is, or for example, conduit, conductors, signal cables that are needed for the future use of APS devices on all new and reconstructed signalized intersections and signalized mid-block crossing locations. And there's additional guidance available in the Traffic Engineering Manual, that's the TEM, section 3.7, for the installation and operation criteria for APS on the state highway system. So that was a very good question, and I'm glad that it was asked so that we could highlight this provision in the FDM. So if you have any questions that are specific to how and when and where APS is going to be installed, those are obviously they're going to be project specific questions that I'm not going to be able to answer for you because I have a state responsibility. I can answer more general type questions, but if it's project specific, I would encourage you to reach out to your district PM first, and then they might want to pull in the district traffic operations engineer in their office as well. So just be advised that this is the expectation for all new and reconstructed signalized intersections and signalized mid-block crossings. Excellent. Next question, when would a project trigger relocating and bringing pedestrian push buttons up to compliance? Is it only if it includes signal work, or should this be included with any ramp or detectable warning work? Okay, the answer to this is going to be it depends. And I hate to give that answer, but for a standard 3R project, signal work likely is not going to be included in the scope. But when signal work is included in the scope of a 3R project, then yes, of course, making appropriate corrections and upgrades to pedestrian push buttons would definitely be expected and included in that type of project. And that, in my mind, raises the question of how is that addressed in the FDM? And you're not going to find that in chapter 2 of the FDM for design criteria. But if we go back to part 1 of the FDM for development and processes, I'm going to bring that window up. And I happen to know that I want to go to chapter 114 for resurfacing, restoration, and rehab. That's the 3R chapter. If we bring up that chapter, then I'm going to search for the word deficiencies. Or no, I'm going to search for the word improvements. And here in section 1.1 of chapter 114, there's language and there's additional language in other portions of this chapter, but it's basic. You know what? I'm going to look for the word identify. This is what I was thinking in chapter 114, section 2, planning and programming of 3R projects. It's the expectation of the FDM, and I would say a requirement of the FDM, to identify potential modifications to meet anticipated future conditions. Read on and on. This will typically include reviewing local and district plans for desired ped and bicycle transit facilities along the project corridor to identify opportunities for improvement as part of a 3-hour project. So at the end of the day, my advice and recommendation would be that any engineer of record for a project should walk the limits of the project as the scope is being developed, and you can coordinate, of course, with the district PM to have them have the department present for that walkthrough as well. But my recommendation has always been to take a clipboard and a piece of paper, or today's technology, take an iPad or other mobile device, and take pictures and document instances where you have identified opportunities for improvement along the project corridor, and then those should be hopefully incorporated into the project scope as the district has the availability to do that. But it all comes back to making our pedestrian facilities on the state highway system accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities, and improving the safety and accessibility of our facilities for all users. So those are kind of the guiding or operating principles that you need to be in the back of your head when you're thinking about these types of issues. The next question is, does the curb ramp's orientation on opposing ends need to be perpendicular to one another? If I understand what the question is asking there, then I'm going to answer it by pulling back up chapter 222. That's wrong chapter there. Chapter 222, and it's, if you attended the webinar on November 2nd, you may recall that I cited a particular slide. It said it was my favorite slide in the entire slide deck. And this is the section of the FDM that slide was addressing. Curb ramps should be in line with the crossing and must provide maximum slope of 1 to 12 or 8.3%. Well, I encouraged in that 11.2 presentation for the design community and the transportation industry in general to read this should as a harder must. Curb ramps must, and of course the reason it says should is because it's not always achievable, and because it's not achievable in a lot of instances, we did not want to create a condition with the language here that would require that an ADA design variation be required. We didn't want to do that as often as it would likely have occurred. So it's a should condition. Therefore, when you can't do it, it does not require a design variation. But I would suggest to you, and you've probably heard me state this before, that where we can do better, we should do better. So where the curb ramps can be made perfectly in line with the crossing direction, we absolutely should do that. But the language here understands that that's not always going to be achievable, so it's not a must condition. And to go on, it says there's some language in here that says that essentially that a curb ramp must be provided on both ends of each crossing. And as I stated on 11.2, the reason for that provision is so that we don't invite a pedestrian into the crossing, which is in the vehicular way, on one end, and then not give them a way to escape that situation on the other end. So if you have a curbed intersection on both ends of the crossing, then of course, even if there is no sidewalk on the opposite end, you must give them a means of escape, let's say, from the intersection. On the end that doesn't have a sidewalk, you want to provide at minimum a curb ramp with a level landing at the top.
Hey, Brad, I had a question that came in related to ramps. Yeah, so the question says, is there an official ADA variance for extreme situations? Like, for an example, an existing curb ramp that is out of compliance but would require right-of-way to remedy?
I wouldn't say that there's a special ADA variation, but it would be that would require a variation because the agreement between FHWA Florida Division and FDOT from back in 2003, and that agreement continues to this day, is that in a 3R project, that all curb ramps, all doesn't leave anything out, so all curb ramps and detectable warning surfaces are to be brought up to existing standards. So where that cannot be achieved, it's going to require design variation, and it sounds like from this particular instance that it might require conversation with the district PM and possibly the DDE and anybody else that they deem is appropriate for that discussion. But there's not an easy out, I guess, is a good answer for that. There's not an easy out. It's going to have to take a little bit more digging than we're probably used to.
All right, this one came in a little bit earlier, and this is in regards to FDOT Index 522. So basically, if I understand correctly, a design engineer would have to prove that ramps surfaces cannot be provided inline before attempting to deviate. There are FDOT optional details that deviate from inline in the later 522 index sheets.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. In this particular situation, the language in the FDM is a should condition, and I was trying to explain earlier, and perhaps I didn't do a good job of it, but the reason it's stated as should instead of must, that the curb ramps be in line with the crossing, is because the folks up here in Tallahassee realize and understand that there are going to be many instances where the ramps just simply cannot be perfectly aligned with the roadway crossing. As unfortunate as that is, we recognize that it's going to happen more often than not. So rather than coding into the FDM a situation that was going to necessitate design variations for the alignment of the ramp to be processed so frequently, we rather would like engineers to exercise engineering judgment and do the absolute best they can, which means that they're going to provide perfectly aligned curb ramps where that is achievable. So where it's not achievable because of site constraints or geometry or any other reason, a design variation is not going to be rigorously required in those instances.
All right, very good. Another question that came in. So are there remedies for the finalized curb ramps designs that are touching or adjacent to each other that create a low point and ultimately create a compounded angle that creates ponding and drainage issues? Perhaps redesign or spacing and separating the two detectable ramps by moving one of the crosswalk alignments?
Yeah, I think that the question pretty much answers itself right there at the end. It's going to require the engineer to investigate and to provide additional details that will address any anticipated ponding issues or really any other issue. Just to restate what I said earlier about the standard plans, that I spoke, actually it's been more than a year ago now, but I spoke with the standard plans engineer here in Tallahassee. His office is just right around the corner from mine. And he explained his position, and he was the standard plans engineer at the time. He stated that the purpose of the standard plans is to provide a pictorial representation of the minimum criteria that is to be provided on the state highway system. But there's absolutely nothing in the standard plans of the FDM that would prohibit an engineer from exercising their own judgment and doing better, greater, providing more, whatever the situation dictates. And whenever I've made that statement in the past, usually I get a barrage of responses that say, but the DOT district is going to comment on the fact that I'm not providing a standard detail or a standard dimension for that criteria or whatever. And my response to them is that it's the engineer's responsibility, the EOR's responsibility, and well, let's just say it's the EOR's responsibility to provide an appropriate solution for all the site-specific conditions that exist in that location. And if the EOR's details are commented on by a DOT reviewer, then it's the EOR's responsibility to explain their exercising of the engineering judgment and have that discussion with the department reviewer or the PM or whoever is making the comment. Because the engineer's seal is on the document, I would definitely encourage that discussion to be had before they just summarily make a change because they received a comment about it. It really boils down to how strongly do they feel about that particular instance or detail.
All right, that's excellent, Brad. I had one more question come in, and then we'll get back to the ones we had pre-programmed. So if you're adding EV parking, electric vehicle parking spaces to the far side of a parking lot, are they required to include a handicap parking space?
That's a good question. And I wanted to bring to everyone's attention that if we go back to the FAQ document, which I'm trying to show on the screen here, there is the very last category here in the bookmark section is electric vehicle charging stations. So there's some guidance here on the installation of EV charging and parking. I'm trying to remember if one of these questions specifically answers the question about where are curb ramps required, what are dimensions, how many accessible EV charging station parking stalls should be provided. A minimum of 1 accessible parking stall should be provided. See the ADA standards for accessible design, chapter or section 228 for additional guidance there. Also, I would encourage our design community to reach out to the local jurisdiction for where the project is located. If you're providing EV charging stations, then there may be local codes or ordinances that come into play in those instances. Because remember, the DOT standard plans are only technically or specifically applicable within the state highway system and its right of way. So if a local agency is utilizing DOT standard plans, like a city or county is making reference to the DOT standards, that's good and that's fine, but there may be requirements that go beyond what the DOT says for particular jurisdictions and locations. So I would encourage you to reach out to those jurisdictions to see if there's something more that needs to be considered. Okay, with that said, if there are no more real-time questions, then we'll just continue on with what we have here on our slide. The question says on slide, okay, thank you, Kristen. On slide 62 from the presentation, why must it match the sidewalk width? And the it there is, why must the width of the sidewalk for the median crossing match the sidewalk width? Why can't it be wider or hold more peds? And I believe that they're probably referring to this last paragraph here that I've kind of clouded with red here. And it says the width of the sidewalk for the median crossing should, and I lined through that and said think must. So the width of the sidewalk through the median crossing must match the adjacent sidewalk width. The idea here is to not reduce the available walking surface width in the median from what's being provided on the connecting sidewalk ends. So the idea is to not reduce the available walking surface width. If in an engineering judgment, the engineer expects or wants to provide additional width, then again, where you can do more, you should feel free and available to do more. Or not available, but able. You should feel free and able to do more where that's appropriate based on your engineering judgment. Next question, considering 3R projects do not necessarily require sidewalk updates, should sidewalk tripping hazards found during field reviews, such as uneven or cracked slabs, be dealt with through maintenance or 3R design projects? And I would refer you back to the language I pointed to earlier in chapter 114, and I'll see if I can bring that up here pretty quickly. That's 114 right there. So in section 2 of 114, it very specifically says to identify opportunities for improvement as part of 3R project. So this goes back to what I was suggesting earlier, that the engineer of record for the project schedule a meeting on site with the district PM, and together both the EOR and the department walk the project limits, looking for instances such as these that are mentioned in the question that can be improved as part of the 3R project. At the end of the day, it's the district's decision whether or not to improve some of those issues in the scope. So I can't give you a pat answer from central office in Tallahassee. It's going to be a project specific decision answered at the district level. Next question, on 3R projects, are driveway approaches required to be upgraded to ADA compliance? And the answer to that is no, they are not rigorously required. But if we go to chapter 222, which I already have up here, chapter 222, and what I'm going to search for, I'm going to go to page 1 of this chapter, and then I'm going to search for the term 3R. And this is the sidewalk section that addresses how to work that in a 3R project. And I'm going to go to the next occurrence of 3R. And here's where driveways are addressed in section 2.2.1 of chapter 222. The last paragraph of that section says, for 3R projects, unaltered driveways that are not in compliance with the standard plans or ADA requirements are not required to be reconstructed. What that means, in other words, is that if the driveway correction is not already included in the scope of the project, then it does not have to be corrected as part of a 3R project. And that goes back to that 2003 memo from FHWA Florida Division to the FDOT.
Hey, Brad, before we go on to temporary traffic control, can you jump ahead to slide 39 to one of our extra questions? I had someone in chat here wanted to see if we would get to this question. Yes, that is the one.
Sure. Okay. Are detectable warning surfaces on all stop control driveways required for 3R projects, even if the existing driveway is substandard and will not be reconstructed? That is, the existing driveway provides a sidewalk width of less than 4 feet due to the flares. And this sounds like a pretty project-specific type answer. So I'm going to answer generally off the top of my head my opinion on this. But the engineer needs to reach out to the PM in the district and get a definitive answer from them on this particular issue. But generally speaking, the answer is yes. We would want to provide correct or standard detectable warning surfaces at all controlled driveways as part of a 3R project. And the reason is it goes back to the memo that I just referenced a moment ago, the 2003 memo from FHWA Florida Division to the FDOT. That was the agreement from 2 decades ago, that on 3R projects, the DOT is going to, by standard operating procedure, we're going to upgrade ramps and detectable warning surfaces to the appropriate existing standard.
All right, thanks, Brad.
You're
and
welcome.
I think we were back on slide 24, but I do have a few questions that have come in from folks. So
okay, go ahead.
Let's grab those. Yeah. So this one related to 3R that just came in. Should the entire sidewalk adjacent to a 3R project road be replaced if some sidewalk segments are replaced due to drainage structure improvements for continuity of alignment and not create variations in surface material and potential elevation changes in the sidewalk?
That's a very good question. And it sounds like it's getting into a very project specific type response that I'm not going to be able to provide. But let me say this, speaking very generally, that the FDM here in section 2.1 of chapter 222, the last paragraph, says that in 3R projects, other than meeting detectable warning and curb ramp requirements, unaltered sidewalks, in other words, sidewalk correction was not included specifically in the scope, that are not in compliance with the FDM or ADA requirements are not required to be constructed. Now, the question is stating, though, that there are some incremental, let's say, or discrete sections of sidewalk that are being corrected. And that, in my mind, is touching on or invoking what the ADA regulations refer to as alterations. So I think we're getting into the alterations provision of the federal requirements by the ADA. And what the alterations provision essentially says, that existing conditions can remain without being addressed if and until that particular area is altered by a construction project. So once you start altering the sidewalk, the district needs to think long and hard about including the remaining sections of sidewalk. So essentially doing the whole thing instead of just doing incremental segments. But again, that's my general response and my opinion off the top of my head. I believe that the district PM and possibly the district design engineer, the DDE, need to be brought into that discussion to get a more definitive project specific answer.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Brad. An earlier question that we had here, does FDOT have guidance on transition segment parameters between curb ramps and existing sidewalks?
I'm not sure that I understand that completely. So if the person who is asking that question wants to raise your hand and unmute, we can see if we can address that. If you're not comfortable doing that with 137 people on the line, then reach out to me after this, maybe later this afternoon or tomorrow. My contact information is available pretty easily on that ADA webpage I referenced earlier. And my email address is there too, but it's brad.bradley@dot.state.fl.us. I'd be happy to talk with you about that. I just don't know that I completely understand the question at this time.
All right. Another one here. If you have a crosswalk, are shifts in the roadway crosswalk striping allowed? And if so, I mean, how do we handle that? It seems like it might be difficult for people with low vision to follow that.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. I think the answer from my opinion, again, as the state ADA coordinator, my opinion is that we provide tangent alignment crossings everywhere we have a roadway crossing. Now, are there conditions, especially in the temporary traffic control environment during construction, where that's not going to be achievable? Maybe so, but it's the engineer's responsibility to reconcile all those requirements and provide mitigation for where there needs to be an alignment shift in a crosswalk, because by federal requirements under Title II, we have a responsibility to provide clear and effective communication with someone who's disabled that is just as clear to someone who's not disabled. So in this environment, we're talking about visual input. Our visual communication is obvious to someone who is sighted. But for someone who has low or no vision, if we start adjusting the alignment mid crosswalk, there has to be something there that is non-visual, physically detectable, that clearly and effectively communicates the direction change of the crosswalk. I hope that answered the question, and if we need to discuss further, then reach out to me later.
All right, sounds good. Let's get back to the presentation and slide 24, and we'll take a few more questions in just a little bit. I did have one clarification. When you were talking about the FDM earlier, I think you were, may means optional, should is preferred, and shall is must. Is that right?
That's yeah, pretty reasonable understanding of those words, yes.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, question here on slide 24 under the category of temporary traffic control. is for a temporary pedestrian path utilizing existing traffic lane. Does the traffic lane also need to be corrected for cross slopes greater than 2%? I would say this is a fantastic question because the engineer or the person asking the question is thinking about what the ADA requirements stipulate. And it says that Chapter 240 says that ADA requirements are in full force and effect. Essentially, that's my paraphrase. It's not a quote, but ADA requirements are fully applicable in a temporary traffic control condition. That means that the walking surface cannot exceed a cross slope of 2%. So if you're deviating a walking surface, a sidewalk, a closed sidewalk, if you're deviating that into a closed traffic lane and the roadway cross slope is greater than 2% already, then how do we address that? And the answer is it's going to be a project specific issue. It needs to be a discussion with the project PM. I would suggest to you though, maybe it could be done that way as long as the impacted length of that running distance is not excessive. And of course, excessive is a wildly subjective term. So it's gonna require engineering judgment to determine the best way to address those situations. But I don't think, and I did read a question like this or similar to this before we came online today, and I think the person went on to ask if, well, no, it says right here, also, does it need to be corrected for cross slopes greater than 2%? I think correcting roadway cross slope for a sidewalk project is probably going to be way outside the scope and budget available for that particular project. So it needs to have a discussion with the PM and the DDE for that district. But I really appreciate the fact that engineers and our designers are thinking about these issues now, because it's very important. Right, the next question. Where is the quarter-mile temporary traffic control diversion documented? And I'm going to bring up Chapter 240 of the FDM 240. And I'm just going to do Control F, 0.25. And that's where the answer is. So it's in section 2.1.9 of Chapter 240. And specifically it says, keep detour length and diversions as short as practicable. And then it goes on to define what's considered practicable, or what's considered preferable, I guess, is the way you'd say that. Paragraph A says detours should not create more than a 30% increase in length of the non-motorized facility, or not longer than half a mile for bikes or a quarter mile for peds. That's a good question. And hopefully everybody can see that I don't necessarily always have the specific citations to the FDM and standard plans memorized, but I do know where to find them pretty quickly. And keep in mind that Control F is a fantastic tool when you get into situations where you need to find something pretty fast. The next question on slide 26 is, does the definition of pedestrian include motorized scooters or micro mobility devices? And I would suggest to you that because of the way the FDM defines it, let me bring that up in Chapter 222. Okay, Chapter 222, and I know that it's on the first page. It says the term pedestrian used in this chapter includes any person traveling on foot or in a wheelchair. Well, this term wheelchair is probably pretty dated now, and we should probably update it. I would suggest to you that at this time you could pretty safely interpret the word wheelchair to mean any type of mobility aid, usually a wheeled mobility aid, but really even crutches or canes would all be applicable to the spirit of this provision. Question on slide 27 is the MobiMat on the APL? And the answer is, I don't know for sure, because I did not get a chance before this session to look at that. But what I would suggest to you is that you could probably perform a browser search pretty easily for FDOT approved products list. That's what APL stands for. So look for FDOT approved products list, and then you could likely find whether or not MobiMat is found there pretty easily. If it's not on the APL, then my suggestion would be to reach out to your district PM. And I hate to defer questions away from myself. I like to be able to answer all of them, but unfortunately, I don't have that ability or authority to do that. But reach out to the district and just ask the question if they have any special TSPs or anything that they've already used for other projects that allow for the use of APL, of MobiMat. I do know for a fact, because I've seen it in place, that District 5 has used them quite extensively throughout the districts or throughout the counties there in D5. So if you're working in a district other than 5 and you need some additional information, I'm sure that if you call the District 5 ADA coordinator, they can probably put you in touch with that information. And with that, what I'm going to do is bring up another website. Actually, it's the DOT ADA website that I showed you earlier. I want to scroll down to the link here. This is my contact information under State ADA Coordinator. And below that is a hot link to ADA contact information. When you click there, it brings up a map of the state of Florida broken up into colors by different districts. You have 3, 2, 5, 7, 1, 4, and 6. So if you click on District 5, then it's going to take you right to the District 5 ADA coordinators for buildings. In D5 is Christopher Roth, and in D5 for roadways, the ADA coordinator is Miss Stephanie Moss. So if either of these two contacts, if they don't know the answer specifically, then they will definitely put you in contact with the folks in the district who do have that answer. All right. Kristen, Sam, are there any other questions that have come in?
No, Brad, I don't think we have any questions. We did have a comment. I don't know if this has been discussed yet, but they said District 6, City of Miami Beach, they have used a lot of those, and the Access Rec Mats. The MobiMat is the brand, but not sole source. So just something to share.
Okay, thank you, Kiriana. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I would expect the MobiMat or similar product are probably used a lot by coastal communities to provide beach access to their public facilities there. But of course, in those cases, we're not talking about something that the Florida DOT would necessarily get into providing beach access. But the MobiMat, I have seen that used very successfully within the temporary traffic control environment for our construction projects. Okay, we've already gone through the list of questions that we had set aside, but we did have some overflow questions, I guess we could say, in case we got through the earlier ones quicker than we thought. So we'll just continue on with that bucket of questions. Slide 31 is lately we have been installing a lot of sidewalks on our mill and resurface projects. They seem to meander a lot with almost a 90-degree angle, and the sidewalks also are following the contour of existing elevation. So we end up with sidewalks that seem too steep at times and I guess with abrupt angles. What are your thoughts on this? Well, my thoughts on this harken back to that provision in chapter 222, and I've shown it a couple times, so I'm not going to go back to it for this particular question. But there's a provision in chapter 222 which states that when the sidewalk is adjacent to a roadway, then the grades of that sidewalk are permitted to follow the profile grade of the adjacent road. In this question, they're saying that there are times that the alignment of the sidewalk is meandering and not remaining parallel to the mainline roadway. And my answer or my opinion off the top of my head is that you have to consider what the spirit of the intent of that provision is in the FDM when the letter cannot be rigorously followed. And what I mean by that is that you may have a situation where a hybrid solution comes up, so that the portions of the walking surface that are indeed parallel to and adjacent with the mainline roadway, that those sections of sidewalk are permitted to follow the profile grade of that roadway. But when you have sections of the walking surface that are not and cannot be justifiably argued that they are adjacent to the roadway, if you catch my drift, then those segments of the walking surface would probably need to follow the ramp criteria. And I would direct your attention to the Florida Building Code for that, for the specifics on what that criteria is. But it's an ADA ramp is essentially anything with a grade greater than 5% up to 8.33% max. And it requires handrails and level landings, and level landings at rises no more than 30 inches between level landings and so forth. But those requirements are in the Florida Building Code. But that's a really good question. I appreciate the thoughtfulness that is being expressed in a lot of these questions. Thank you very much. Next question on slide 32. Can you stamp the concrete and use stain on the concrete instead of using brick on sidewalks? And I would say that you're always, the safest bet always for DOT project is to use an APL product. So a product that's already pre-approved, it's on the APL, the approved products list. That's going to be the safest bet. Now, what the general requirements are for the detectable warning surface are the grid pattern of the truncated domes, the shape of the truncated domes, and the fact that the expectation or the requirement is that there be a contrasting color between the detectable warning surface and the surrounding walking surface that it's on. So if an engineer wants to go, I'm going to say go on their own and try to meet those requirements independent of the APL, then I don't see why they couldn't try that. But I would recommend talking with the appropriate PM, either for the department or for the local jurisdiction, before you attempt that, because you don't want to get in a situation where you've provided details, it's been constructed, and then someone down the line says, nope, this is not what we want. So yeah, have that discussion early on and try to get it all ironed out before the concrete hits the dirt. Question on slide 33, what cross slope do you recommend during design so that during construction, the cross slope does not exceed 2%? This is a question that we have received for as long as I've been doing ADA, which is since early 2019. And the simplest way to answer this is that the FDM specifies a maximum cross slope of 2%. The spec book in section 522 specifies the concrete finishing requirements for the walking surface of sidewalks. So the contractor and the engineer are responsible, working together, to provide a walking surface that does not exceed 2%. So the DOT has taken the position that we're not going to get into the means and methods of the contractor. And we're also not going to try to specify a value less than 2% max, because that it complicates the issue and makes the water much more murky in this, in trying to specify those types of requirements. So my predecessor, Dean Perkins, used to say use 1.6 or 1.7% in your plans. I'm not saying from a policy decision to do that. I'm saying that's what people in the past have recommended, but the current DOT guidelines don't get into the means and methods of the contractor, and the expectation is that the engineer will exercise appropriate engineering judgment to make sure that the that the built product is going to be compliant. So if that requires making sure that the contractor and the engineer are on the same page. Okay, slide 34. Can the running slope exceed 8.3% when matching grade of the road? And the answer to that is yes. It's an emphatic yes. As long as the walking surface, the sidewalk in this case, is following and adjacent to a roadway, it can follow the roadway's profile. Where you will get into trouble is when the existing terrain of the location of the sidewalk is going to deviate from the profile grade of the roadway. Then you're probably going to get into some cut and fill requirements there to make sure that the sidewalk is mirroring the roadway's profile and not becoming its own independent facility in a way. Slide 35, can we install a 4-foot mat at a 5-foot ramp if we center it up with only a bare minimum not covered in order to allow dirt and debris to get by? And the answer to that is no. If you go back to chapter 222 of the FDM, chapter 240, 232, okay, 222, and I'm going to go to section 222 point, I think it's 3. Yes, detectable warnings. It says here that install the detectable warnings to cover the full width of the walking surface and then 2 feet deep. And I'll add the phrase in the direction of ped travel. So install the detectable warnings to cover the full width of the walking surface. The expectation is that the detectable warning surface will extend far enough so that the human foot cannot step in a gap and miss the warning message of the detectable warning surface entirely. So I can almost hear some of the engineers in the audience saying, well, what's far enough? And I guess a common rule of thumb, in my opinion, would be within 1.5 inches of the edge of the walking surface. So the detectable warning surface should extend at least, when we say it extends the full width of the walking surface, I would say at least within 1.5 inches of the edge of the walking surface or up against the curbs if there's a curb return for the ramp. But the idea is that there will be no gaps large enough for the human foot to step in that gap and miss the warning message.
Hey, Brad, wanted to take a step back when you were talking about
Okay.
the stamped concrete. So if that has more than 1/4 inch of a ridge, then that's not going to meet ADA criteria. Is that right? It seems like it'd be a tripping hazard.
Well, I guess it depends on, if there is a vertical change in level that exceeds 1/4 inch, then the answer is yes, it's gonna not be compliant. That's why the truncated dome configuration is specified in the ADA regulations and specified in DOT standards is that the height of that dome is 0.2 inches off the walking surface, off the surrounding walking surface. So that would, in addition to the other issues that I brought up earlier, one would definitely need to make sure that there are no changes in level that exceed 1/4 inch. And again, that's why the truncated dome height is specifically listed as 0.2. Okay, I think this was the next question. Yeah. Slide 36 says, when a proposed 12-foot wide shared use path abuts the commercial driveway on a state roadway, does the requirement for a 2% cross slope for the pedestrian crosswalk need to be 12 feet wide, or does the minimum width of 4 feet apply to the crosswalk? And when I read this before this class, it made me think, and I went to chapter 240, 224, I believe it is the chapter for shared use paths. So on the screen, we're going to the shared use path in the FDM. That chapter is chapter 224. Go there, and I did a Control F search for the word width. And the very first hit in section 2 of chapter 224 is labeled curb ramps, and it says provide curb ramps to be the same width as the path. You may recall that I already pointed that out. If not today, I definitely pointed it out in the webinar on November 2nd. But that the FDM in chapter 222 also has a similar provision that says that the curb ramp width, it says provide curb ramp width that is equal to the sidewalk width that's connecting to that ramp. The entirety of the idea that's being conveyed by these provisions is that we, as the DOT, don't want to unnecessarily reduce the usability or the accessibility of a pedestrian facility by unnecessarily necking down the walking surface width at our ramps. If we have a 5-foot wide sidewalk, then we want to provide a 5-foot wide curb ramp. The same is true in our crosswalks, that if the crosswalk is connected to the example in the question is a 10-foot wide curb ramp and sidewalk, then yes, you would want the full width of that 10-foot wide crosswalk to be compliant with cross slope requirements. I think what the questioner might be referring to here by 4 feet, which that's not even a DOT number that you'll see in the FDM for width of our walking surfaces. The narrowest walking surface that's allowed in a C1 or C2 context classification is 5 foot. But I think what they might be thinking about here is that the way the ADA regulations at the federal level, and I believe PROAG is written in a similar way, it says that regardless of how wide the walking surface is of the pedestrian facility, that a minimum of 4 feet, or the current federal minimum is 36 inches, 3 feet. So the current federal minimum is 3 feet. The PROAG minimum is going to require 4 feet. The DOT minimum is 5 feet. But that generally, the way the federal government thinks about it is that no matter how wide the walking surface is, that at least 3 feet or 4 feet of that width is going to be fully compliant. Well, DOT has taken the stance that if we're providing a wider facility because of the necessity due to the volume in those context classifications, then we want the entirety of the walking surface to be compliant with the 2% cross slope. Same would be true in the crosswalk. Hopefully that answered your question. I apologize if I got the ramble on there, but I was trying to think through how to explain that. On slide 37, the question is, would it be a good practice to keep all slopes at 1 to 12 for simplicity? And I'm guessing that this is probably from an engineer, because I'm an engineer, and I think in these terms of trying to standardize and make things as simple as possible and make them consistent. And I agree with the whole idea of providing consistency in our elements. But when it comes to our slopes for curb ramps, you probably, or you might have heard me say on the 11.2 broadcast that engineers should endeavor to provide the least slope achievable when it comes to any type of curb ramp or sloped walking surface from one elevation to another. Engineers and the entire transportation community should be thinking of providing the least slope achievable. And 1 to 12 should be considered an absolute maximum, but not a desired standard grade or slope for our curb ramps. Slide 38 says if a curb ramp was installed previously and met the ADA guidelines at time of installation, however, it currently does not meet ADA guidelines now, and I'm milling and resurfacing, is the ramp grandfathered into the previous guidelines and not required to be upgraded? And the answer to that in this case is no. It goes back to that memo dated 2003 from FHWA Florida and the FDOT, where the agreement was that in a 3-hour project, all curb ramps and detectable warning surfaces will be corrected to existing standards. Slide 39.
This is the one that we had done earlier, Brad.
That's right.
So I'll skip over that one. I did have a question from earlier. So if just the curb adjacent to the driveway is being replaced in kind, does that force upgrades to the existing driveway?
So just the curb at the driveway interface is being requested or replaced. I think in that situation, and I hate to do it, but I think the answer is going to be to have that discussion with the appropriate jurisdiction. Excuse me. You're going to want to have that discussion with the appropriate jurisdiction's project manager. But I think you're probably touching on, if not delving completely into the alterations provision of the ADA regulations. So I guess what I'm feeling compelled to say is that if you're adjusting the interface point of the mainline roadway with the driveway, then probably the alterations provision of the ADA regulations is going to necessitate correcting the sidewalk through that driveway. But I think it's going to fall primarily to engineering judgment and district a district decision. I hate to do that. I hate to keep deferring to the district, but for project specific issues, that's what I'm compelled to do.
All right, thanks, Brad. We had another question that came in. Who is responsible for sidewalk maintenance? Is it FDOT or the municipality?
Well, the DOT is going to be responsible for sidewalk maintenance when the sidewalk is within the state highway system right of way, and the local agencies are going to be responsible for the local roadway network. And the only variations to that answer probably will be unless there's a maintenance agreement of some sort between the state and a local jurisdiction for the limits of the sidewalk. But I think generally speaking, of course, the DOT districts are going to be responsible for sidewalk surfaces within the right of way for the state highway.
All right, very good. So hey, Brad, I know we've got about 4 minutes left. I think we have like 7 slides left. So do we want to try to just do a rapid fire and kind of get through these and we can wrap them all up? Does that work?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. Thank you.
And we can go over if you're available. We can go past noon, so that's entirely up to you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Kristen. On 3R projects, should sidewalk be provided on both sides of the road? Well, I'm not going to go to the provision in the FDM because of time, but the FDM says that for new construction conditions, ideally we're going to provide sidewalk on both sides, but there's a provision there that says that if sidewalk on both sides is not achievable, then provide appropriate crossing locations to pedestrian destinations on the opposite side. So the answer to the question is it's going to boil down to a district decision ultimately, but generally speaking, we do want to have sidewalks on both sides of the roadway, but that provision in the FDM applies specifically to new construction. Next question, if there's sidewalk on only one side of the road, is it required? Okay, that's pretty much the same answer or same question. To confirm if milling or resurfacing is being done within the corridor, we do not need to upgrade non-compliant sidewalks except curb ramps and intersections. The answer to that generally is yes, unless the district has opted to include sidewalk correction in the scope. Just to verify, on 3R projects, are driveway approaches required to be? Same answer. Generally no, unless the district has specifically included that in the scope. Page 141, this shows putting an LCD across sidewalk, but then there's an area past that where there's an open sidewalk. If there is if there's somewhere that a person has to get to on foot, such as doctor's office, now you've blocked it off. Having the one at the actual closure makes sense, but the advanced one does not. Yes, this is where, again, the whole idea of standard plans details is that they are a pictorial representation of the minimum expectations on the state highway system. Application of standard plans does not relieve an engineer of record from providing the appropriate details to make the site-specific condition operate the way it's supposed to. So engineers are not alleviated from their engineering responsibility just because a standard plan is shown a certain way. Appropriate details need to be provided to make it functional. Can you recommend any manuals for providing PED detours within work zones? I can't specifically, but I would encourage definitely that chapter 240 of the FDM is referenced, as well as our standard plans index 102 standard plans. But then ultimately the engineers of record are going to have to reconcile the necessary requirements and make them work within the existing field conditions for their locations. Does the FDOT district in Tallahassee allow Creative Outdoors to install benches to be placed in the grass at a bus stop, or because of ADA have they been removed? The long story short, when it comes to benches that appear on sidewalks within the state highway system, is that they have to be there by permit, and if they are placed without a permit, then the district by statute has to notify the apparent owner of the bench about its improper location. And there's a certain time period. I want to say it's 3 days. It may be 5 days. It may be different. I can't remember the time period, but there's a statute that governs this situation. And essentially the DOT will make the notification, will wait the appropriate statutory length of time, and then the DOT can remove it ourselves and take it back probably to a maintenance yard. Can Braille be used to direct the correct pedestrian path? That's a good question. And I think for national consistency, the best reference for that condition is going to be the MUTCD. I'm not aware of anything in the FDOT design guidance or standard plans that calls for or permits Braille, but it's something that could be considered as long as it's going to work with the national requirements of the MUTCD, and the DOT district is amenable to that approach. And that is the end of the slide deck, Kristen.
Awesome. That's great. We got through everything. So great job, Brad. A lot of information that we have put out there today. We are also going to be publishing a written Q&A, kind of going through these as well. So if you need to go back and reference something that we talked about today, we will have that ready probably in a week or so, and we'll make sure that everyone is notified. But Brad, I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of close us out and wrap us up.
Well, thank you, Kristen, and I really appreciate Florida LTAP being such a fantastic resource for the DOT to use to provide a platform where we can get this information out and have this kind of information exchange with the transportation community, not just here in Florida, but as demonstrated at the 11-2 event just a few weeks ago. We had attendees from all over the country, from coast to coast. So that's really exciting for us, and we're glad that there's a lot of interest in the ADA. And if I can leave you with a point or two to remember, always where you can do more, I would say do more, because we're not only addressing accessibility, but we're addressing safety for all users. So if we can do something that improves the usability of a pedestrian facility, that is to say, if we can improve the safety and accessibility for all users, then why wouldn't we do that? If it's not going to have if it's only going to have a negligible impact on scope, schedule, and budget, why not go ahead and make those improvements? And I guess a last thought would be, remember that a standard plan's detail does not alleviate the engineer of record from doing their due diligence and providing necessary details that are constructible for the contractor. Thank you all very much for being on board with us today, and my contact information is pretty easily found on the DOT's ADA website. So if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to entertain those, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Brad. Urel, Sam, anything from you before we close things out?
I'm good. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, everyone, to being here. Urel and Sam, really appreciate you being here as well. To our attendees, thanks for being here for this office hour session. We like to do these from time to time. And if you have any questions, Brad gave you his information. You can always reach out to LTAP as well. So hope everyone has a great rest of your week, and we'll see you on the next Florida LTAP webinar. Take care.